The voice came from the back of the studio. Emilia Clarke stopped talking, stood up, and Jimmy Fallon had no idea what was happening. It was a Tuesday night in March 2024. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. Studios 6A at 30 Rockefeller Plaza. Cameras rolling live. Emilia Clarke was in the guest chair, radiant in an elegant emerald dress, telling a funny story about the final season of Game of Thrones. The audience was laughing. Jimmy was doing his signature enthusiastic reactions. The Roots were ready with musical stings. Everything was perfect. Everything was going exactly as rehearsed. Jimmy had just asked his next question, something about her new film project, when the studio door at the back opened. Not unusual. Production assistants moved in and out during tapings all the time. Nobody paid attention. But then a voice called out. Clear. Strong. Unmistakable. Emmy. Not Emilia. Emmy. The childhood nickname only one person in the world still used. Emilia Clarke froze mid-sentence. Her smile vanished. Her eyes went wide. She turned her head sharply toward the back of the studio, away from Jimmy, away from the cameras, searching for the source of that voice. The audience noticed immediately. The laughter stopped. 300 people suddenly uncertain what they were witnessing. Jimmy's hands were still frozen in mid-gesture from his question. His blue interview card sat untouched on his desk. Emilia? He said, concern creeping into his voice. You okay? She didn't answer. She was staring at the back in trance, one hand slowly rising to cover her mouth. And then Emilia Clarke stood up. Not the polite standing of someone excusing themselves. Not a casual shift in position. This was abrupt. Urgent. Her chair scraped backward. Jimmy's cards slipped from his fingers and scattered across his desk. Cameras were live when a voice rose from the back of the studio and Emilia Clarke stopped the interview and stood up. Jimmy Fallon couldn't understand what was happening. The control room erupted. Director Dave Diamadi was shouting into his headset. What's going on? Did we lose her mic? Why did she stand up? Do we cut to commercial? Producer Gerard Bradford stood behind Dave, staring at the monitor showing Emilia's face, the shock, the disbelief, the tears forming in her eyes. No, Gerard said quietly. Keep rolling. Something real is happening. Emilia took one step away from the guest chair, then another, moving toward the back of the studio. Her hand was still over her mouth. Tears were streaming down her face now, her carefully applied television makeup beginning to streak. Jimmy stood up too, completely lost. Emilia, who's? He looked toward the back in trance, trying to see what she was seeing. The Roots had stopped playing. Questlove lowered his drumsticks. The audience was dead silent. Every person turned in their seats, trying to understand what was unfolding. In the back entrance doorway stood a woman in her 70s. Gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. Simple cardigan and slacks. Leaning slightly on a cane. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes, bright blue, exactly like Emilia's, were sharp and full of tears. Grammy? Emilia's voice cracked, barely audible but caught perfectly by her lapel microphone. Grammy, what are you? How are you here? Jimmy stopped mid-question. The entire studio froze. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened 9 years earlier. Emilia Clarke wasn't always the global superstar who played Daenerys Targaryen. In 2015, she was a rising actress dealing with something most people didn't know about. She'd suffered 2 life-threatening brain aneurysms. The first in 2011, the second in 2013. She'd survived both, but the recovery had been brutal. Months of rehabilitation, speech therapy, the constant fear of another rupture. Through it all, one person had been her rock, her grandmother, Eleanor Clarke. Eleanor had been a nurse for 40 years before retiring. When Emilia was recovering from her second surgery, terrified and weak and wondering if she'd ever act again, Eleanor had moved into her London flat and stayed for 6 months. She'd helped Emilia relearn how to form words properly, She'd held her granddaughter while she cried from the pain and frustration. She'd been there for every small victory, the first full sentence without slurring, the first day without a headache, the first time Emilia laughed again. "You're stronger than you know, Emmy," Eleanor would say, holding Emilia's face between her weathered hands. "This brain of yours survived 2 storms. It can survive anything." Eleanor had a tradition. Every time Emilia booked a new job after her recovery, her grandmother would call and say one thing: "Another dragon conquered." It became their private code. Another audition, another role, another day of defying the odds, another dragon conquered. In 2019, when Game of Thrones ended and Emilia's career exploded with new opportunities, Eleanor was diagnosed with advanced Alzheimer's disease. It progressed quickly. Within a year, Eleanor didn't recognize her own children. Within 18 months, she couldn't remember Emilia's name. The woman who had helped Emilia relearn how to speak was losing her own words, her own memories, her own self. Emilia visited constantly. She'd sit beside her grandmother's bed in the memory care facility in London and talk about her day, her projects, the silly things that happened on set. Eleanor would smile sometimes, a distant, vague smile that suggested she enjoyed the company even if she didn't know who was providing it. The doctors said Eleanor was in the late stages. She had maybe 6 months. She wouldn't get better. She would only slip further away until one day she wouldn't wake up at all. 3 months ago, Emilia had visited on a Thursday afternoon. Eleanor was asleep. Emilia had sat beside her bed, holding her grandmother's hand, crying quietly. She'd whispered, "I got cast in a new film, Grammy. A big one. I wish you could tell me I conquered another dragon." Eleanor hadn't woken up. Hadn't squeezed her hand. Nothing. Emilia had left the facility believing she'd already lost her grandmother to the disease, even though her heart was still beating. She'd flown to New York 2 days ago to promote her new film. The Tonight Show appearance was scheduled. She'd done the pre-interview. She'd rehearsed her talking points. She was going through the motions, smiling for cameras, being the professional actress everyone expected. What she didn't know, what nobody had told her, was that her family had made a decision. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Emilia's mother, Jennifer, had been watching her daughter carefully over the past months. She'd seen how Emilia's smile didn't quite reach her eyes anymore. How she threw herself into work with an almost desperate intensity. How she avoided talking about Eleanor, changing the subject whenever the topic came up. Jennifer knew what grief looked like. And she knew Emilia was grieving a loss that hadn't technically happened yet. The worst kind of grief, the kind where the person is still alive but already gone. 2 weeks ago, Jennifer had called Emilia's publicist with an unusual request. Emilia had a Tonight Show appearance scheduled. Was there any way, any possible way, to arrange something special? Something that might give Emilia one more moment with her grandmother while Eleanor was still here? The publicist had called the Tonight Show producers. Gerard Bradford had listened to the story and made a decision that went far beyond normal television protocol. "We'll fly her to New York," Gerard had said. "First class. A nurse can travel with her. We'll arrange everything." They'd kept it secret from Emilia. They'd coordinated with her family, with Eleanor's care facility, with doctors who confirmed that Eleanor was stable enough for travel even if she likely wouldn't understand where she was going or why. Yesterday, Emilia Clarke had been on a flight from London to New York. She'd slept most of the way, the nurse beside her monitoring her carefully. She had no idea she was going to see her granddaughter. She didn't remember having a granddaughter. Tonight, 30 minutes before the Tonight Show taping began, Gerard had brought Eleanor to the studio. She'd been confused, asking the nurse where they were, why everything was so bright and loud. The nurse had settled her in a quiet room backstage, given her tea, kept her calm. And then, during Emilia's interview, Gerard had made a call. He'd walked Eleanor to the back entrance of the studio. He'd opened the door just a crack so she could see the stage, the lights, the cameras. Eleanor had seen a young woman in an emerald dress sitting on a bright stage talking to a man behind a desk. And something in Eleanor's damaged, deteriorating mind had sparked some connection. Some memory that shouldn't have been possible anymore. "Emmy," she'd said, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "That's my Emmy." The nurse, shocked, had barely managed to keep Eleanor from walking straight into the shot. But Eleanor had called out, loud enough for the studio microphones to catch it. And Emilia had heard her grandmother's voice for the first time in 9 months. Behind the scenes, Jimmy made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. Emilia was walking toward her grandmother now, moving through the studio like nothing else existed. She'd forgotten about the cameras. Forgotten about the interview. Forgotten about the 300 people watching. Eleanor stood in the doorway, supported by her nurse, looking confused but smiling. "Emmy?" she said again, uncertain, like she was asking a question rather than stating a fact. "Yes, Grammy," Emilia sobbed, reaching her grandmother and pulling her into a careful embrace. "Yes, it's me. It's Emmy. I'm here." Jimmy Fallon stood beside his desk, watching this reunion unfold 15 feet away from him. He looked at the cameras, at the audience, at his producers in the control room. Every instinct he had as a television host said he should do something. Make a joke, cut to commercial, take control of the situation. But Jimmy had built his career on genuine emotional connection. On being real even when everything around him was performance. And this was real. He made a decision. Jimmy walked away from his desk. He walked past the cameras, past the confused audience members, straight to where Emilia held her grandmother. "Hi," Jimmy said softly to Eleanor. "I'm Jimmy. It's wonderful to meet you." Eleanor looked at him with those sharp blue eyes. "Are you taking care of my Emmy?" "She's actually taking care of all of us," Jimmy said, his voice gentle. "Your granddaughter is pretty amazing." "I know," Eleanor said simply. And for just a moment, one perfect, impossible moment, her eyes were clear. Focused. Present. "I always knew. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming." Jimmy looked back at his desk, at the scattered interview cards, at the show that had completely derailed. Then he looked at Gerard in the control room, visible through the booth window. Gerard nodded once. "Do whatever you need to do." "Emilia," Jimmy said quietly, "would you and your grandmother like to sit down? On stage? We don't have to do the interview. We can just talk." Emilia looked at him through tears, nodding, unable to speak. Jimmy helped Eleanor onto the stage. Not to the guest chair, but to a small couch the prop team quickly rolled out. Emilia sat beside her grandmother, still holding her hand. Jimmy pulled up a chair and sat across from them, not as a host but as a witness. The audience was completely silent. The cameras stayed rolling. "Eleanor," Jimmy said, "Emilia told me you used to be a nurse." 43 years, Eleanor said proudly, her mind briefly clear. "I help people get better." "You helped me get better too, Grammy," Emilia whispered. "After my surgeries. You never left my side." Eleanor looked at her granddaughter, confusion flickering across her face, but she squeezed Emilia's hand. "You're strong, Emmy. Always so strong." Jimmy reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his blue interview cards, the ones he'd been holding when this all began. He handed them to Emilia. "Write down what you want to remember from this moment," he said softly. "Don't let these words disappear." Emilia took the cards, tears streaming down her face. She wrote 3 words. "Another dragon conquered." The audience rose as one. Not applauding yet. Just standing. Bearing witness. Some were crying. Most were. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Eleanor fell asleep on that couch during the commercial break, her head resting on Emilia's shoulder. She wouldn't remember any of it the next day. But Emilia would remember for both of them. Jimmy kept those interview cards. They're framed in his dressing room now, Emilia's handwriting preserved forever. Another dragon conquered.